Smarter Athletes number 3. This is Energy Systems 101. We're going to go through 4 modules, and we're going to start with recognizing and identifying individual energy systems. After that, we're going to look at what's happening at the substrate level. This one's going to be a little bit more science heavy, probably the most science heavy of anything we've done so far. So if you don't have a background in biology, chemistry, this one might be not for you. It's probably a little bit more targeted towards senior grades, exercise science, and people who are interested in a pathway in sports medicine. The third module is learning how to ideally fuel and refuel. And if you've seen Nutrition for Athletes already, we did talk a little bit about nutrient timing there. This is really going to kind of stretch on those concepts a little bit. So if you haven't seen the Nutrition for Athletes modules yet, and you want to kind of preface for learning how to fuel and refuel for energy systems specifically, have a look at Nutrition for Athletes first, specifically that third module we did there on nutrient timing. And the last one we're going to do here is designing workout sessions for specific energy system targets. So thinking about specificity and how it applies to us with respect to where we spend our time and energy in workouts and how we structure those to actually target the right system. So starting with module number 1, we want to kind of make this analogy, all right? So we want to look at our systems as engines. One of the best ways to understand our energy systems individually is to view them as if they're kind of different engines with different capabilities when it comes to the intensity of the work we're doing, the type of fuel that we're using to provide that energy, and of course the duration of use, so how long they can run for as the primary system. It's not a perfect comparison, but it is drawing a pretty good one. So this is the first module, recognizing and identifying each system. And so we're going to use this handy chart quite a few times throughout this course, and we'll start with it because on the left column there, number 1, we're identifying the system or the process or the engine, if you want to call it that. Column 2 is actually looking at the fuel source, the primary substrate that actually makes that system go to work. Column number 3 is referring to the intensity of work wherein that energy system would be the primary worker. And then column 4 on the far right is letting us know what kind of continuous duration tolerance or how long that system or engine can run for as the primary system. So to have a quick look, we're seeing the phosphagen system at the top. It is our maximal or explosive intensity. As a continuous duration goes, we can only get about 6 to 8 seconds out of that. All right, and then we move down the ladder to our anaerobic glycolytic pathway, our aerobic glycolytic pathway, and our oxidative system. And we're going to talk about which each of those 4 systems really mean with respect to their fuel source, their intensity, and their tolerance as we go through part 1 here. So let's start with the phosphagen system. And we will recognize that as our most explosive system for sure, although it is our most explosive and powerful. Unfortunately, we can only rely on it for these short bursts of maximally intense work. The phosphagen system will last for roughly 6 to 8 seconds as a primary system, at which point we start to need to rely on another system, one that is less capable of that explosive or powerful work. So this can kind of give you a pretty good idea really quickly that even the fastest athletes in the world running their 100 meters in 9.8 and 9.9 seconds still need to rely on a second system. That phosphagen system isn't quite enough to get them all the way through. This is the best analogy I can make for the phosphagen system. So if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend it. If you have seen it, this clip probably needs no introduction. That's Paul Walker from Fast and the Furious, and he's pushing that little button on his steering wheel, and it is making the car kind of go into this explosive mode for probably maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and that's a nitrous oxide boost. So that's actually not coming from the fuel that the car runs on. It's not from that internal combustion engine that the car is working with. It's actually a different boost that's providing that explosive force, but unfortunately it's only lasting for a very short period of time, and in this particular case, if you have seen the movie, not enough to get him all the way through. Let's move to the glycolytic pathway now. And the glycolytic system, although it's one system, I speak of it like there are 2 separate engines in the glycolytic system. And this is probably the more common way to teach energy systems because there are significant differences when it comes to what we call fast and slow glycolysis. And we're going to get there in a second. But first, let's think about a mid-sized engine that can still pack a pretty good punch, but it's nowhere close to as explosive as that predecessor that we just talked about, the phosphagen system. Okay, so we can use the glycolytic pathway to sustain either a continuous moderate to high intensity effort for about 45 seconds, or the slow glycolytic pathway to run us a little bit longer. Okay, so this one's a little bit more efficient. We actually are burning up some energy here that's being produced and fueled by carbohydrates, so it's a little bit different from our phosphagen system with that respect as well. But one of the reasons why understanding the glycolytic pathway is a little bit more tricky is because it's kind of subdivided into these two categories. Okay, so we're going to start with a fast glycolysis. And fast glycolysis, also called anaerobic glycolysis, delivers energy at a faster rate for sure, but it also brings fatigue on more rapidly as well. Now, it brings fatigue on a little bit more rapidly because it produces the onset of blood lactate accumulation. When we talk about OBLA, or the onset of blood lactate accumulation, that's the lactic buildup in blood that we can't necessarily get rid of. So we start to take on these new levels. And if you've ever seen a blood lactate test, you see an athlete having like a finger prick done and a finger prick analysis giving them a blood lactate reading, and then they work a little bit harder and they have another finger prick done, another droplet of blood is tested, and then they work a little bit harder and a little bit harder and so forth. And that's actually to determine the threshold at which they start to accumulate, or the onset of blood lactate accumulation, so more than before. And they know where that threshold is with respect to their energy output, or how much effort they can basically produce. That's effectively the difference between their body using slow glycolysis and fast glycolysis. So let's talk about the slow glycolytic pathway here. That's also known as aerobic glycolysis, and it delivers energy at a slightly slower rate. And the reason it delivers it slower is because it's actually buffering some of that blood lactate back through a different cycle, so it can actually be metabolized and used to produce more energy. So if you've done a little bit of chemistry work or biology work and you've studied cellular respiration, you know this as the Krebs cycle. We're not going to define the Krebs cycle too heavily here in this presentation. I will leave that for biology and chemistry class, but we will talk about it a few more times. All right, so when we talk about fast versus slow, and we get a better understanding here, what we need to do is kind of imagine ourselves in the best possible result we could have in a 400-meter race. And what does that look like? And if you've never run a 400-meter race yourself, you've probably at very least been to a track meet. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to let you pick one of those two dots there on the screen. There's the blue and there's the yellow, and it doesn't really matter which one you pick. We're going to kind of go through these paces together. So starting here at the 0-second mark, and the race is underway, and we're looking at an early lead at this point, 11 seconds deep and 22 seconds deep. All right, but by frame 4, 33 seconds deep, the gap is closing up a little bit, and by frame 5, 44 seconds deep, and frame 6, the finish line, 55 seconds deep, and we've seen the outcome there. Now, let's assume that these two racers had the exact same level of fitness and were capable of producing the exact same result. But in this particular example, something happened here. All right, so we saw the blue racer jump out into the early lead and hold on to that early lead until about the 22-second mark. Start to lose that lead around 33 seconds, and by the 44-second mark was actually being passed. So with respect to the energy systems, what happened? We've all seen this happen at a track meet. Maybe that's even happened to you if you're one of the people that have actually run one of those 400-meter races before. And what actually happened was that in frame 2, we can see evidence of the early use of the fast glycolytic pathway, the one that's probably not going to last for that full minute of duration that's necessary. All right, so by relying on that fast glycolytic pathway early, that same racer ends up with earlier fatigue due to the onset of blood lactate accumulation. All right, so this person's not able to develop or deliver energy at the same rate 33 seconds deep into the race because their body was relying too heavily on that early debt. And as a result, at the finishing stretch, they have a lower or less ability to rely on that explosive force production that's going to come from something that we're going to learn a little bit later on about called ATP. Now, ATP is actually the source of all muscular contraction. Now, how much you have available to you is entirely dependent on what energy system you might have been using up to that point. In this particular case, because the blue racer was relying on fast glycolytic pathway too early, the yellow racer has more availability to make that final push to the finish line. It's really important to recognize the difference here because we've all heard athletes make the analogy of going out too hard. And essentially what this means is not properly budgeting enough energy for a specific duration. So recognizing whether or not you've gone out too hard being pretty crucial for a lot of different athletes. And I think you can probably think of some athletic examples, not including a 400-meter race that was kind of ruined or misjudged, where this mistake could also be made. All right, so just have a look at these examples on the screen here, and we see a bike race happening on the left, hockey in the center, and soccer on the far right. If we imagine that far left example being racers climbing up the mountain there, thinking about the same situation, somebody kind of sprinting ahead of the group, but then not having nearly enough energy left for maybe a final attack to the finish line or making it over the crest of that hill before they had a nice downhill opportunity to recover. You could very easily relate that same early and frivolous expense of energy to that situation. All right, and we talk about hockey all the time being this 45-second high-intensity demand where you jump off the bench and the typical shift is going to be a 45-second long, straight up, if the whistle doesn't go anyway, complete bag skate. And if that happens and you go out a little bit too hard, entirely likely that by the end of that 45 seconds, we're looking at being in a pretty significant amount of debt. Or even worse, there's not a good chance for a line change. And 45 seconds goes by and we did budget our energy well, but we certainly didn't budget for 55 or 65 or 75 seconds, which is all too often the case. And then that far right example, that could be a midfielder having to sprint back to recover a ball, or moving in on an attacking play, and is probably spending a little bit too much energy too early before getting the chance to recover, and then maybe not necessarily having enough energy to get back into a defensive position, and maybe giving up too much space on the field and allowing somebody that they were supposed to be defending to kind of get through. So in any situation, it's pretty easy to see how being able to transition between these two systems and being well conditioned with both of them is pretty essential for any high performance athlete. I don't think there's a single example on the screen. I don't really think there's a single example in an invasion territory sport or a conditioning based sport where we wouldn't want to say that both of those systems, the fast glycolytic and the slow glycolytic pathway, need to be extremely well conditioned in order for athletes to not make those costly mistakes of going out too hard and spending a little too much energy too early. And the last system I want to talk about is the oxidative pathway. And this is my exact car, but it is the exact model and color of my very first car in high school, a 1992 Volkswagen Golf with a diesel engine. I did not win any drag races in this car. It was a very slow car, and I will compliment it by saying I spent the least on fuel out of all of my high school friends. What was great about having a car that was so efficient is like our oxidative system. If our oxidative system is efficient, it's great for us because it's our most commonly used system. We rely on it as a primer system to produce all of our low intensity to moderate intensity work. So that's walking, it's jogging, but it's also recovering between plays, jogging back on defense. And all of the time we spend interset in a workout, or all of the time that we're spending after a whistle blows before the play starts again, it's our primary system. And the sooner we can get back into an oxidative situation, the sooner we can start to recover and prepare our bodies for the next explosive or high intensity bout of work. So make no mistake, every single athlete needs to have a well-trained oxidative system. I'll put these two reasons at the front. All right, I'll say that better recovery means that the sooner our bodies can leave that anaerobic state and switch into an oxidative mode, the sooner we begin to recover and recharge. So if I'm talking to football players right now, I'm saying you explode off the line. There's a lot of action for 10 or 15 seconds at maximum. The whistle blows. We have to get set. We have to get ready to move again. And the tempo of the pace could be pretty high. And we have to be able to work with that tempo. And if we have a good oxidative system, we're going to be able to. If we don't, we might be anaerobic for the entire time in between those two plays, meaning that we're going to be nowhere near ready for the next snap. If I'm looking at the other reason there, it's higher tolerance. And I really just have to give you a hypothetical example here. And it's you're imagining that you're in a workout or a situation of competition where the intensity of your effort is gradually increasing. And as an effort is becoming more and more intense, eventually you're going to arrive at an anaerobic state. So it makes sense that you want to delay that outcome for as long as possible. The sooner you arrive at an anaerobic state, the sooner you are taking on debt. And if you are taking on oxygen debt and your opponent is not, we can imagine the outcome. We don't have to watch that 400-meter race example again to know what happens. All right, so athletes who can prioritize the oxidative system are a little different from athletes who just need to make sure they train it well. So I did say every single athlete should have a well-trained oxidative system, but that would be specific to your sport. All right, so I'm going to say that every single athlete out there needs to spend at least some time working in an oxidative setting, but there are probably very few athletes who have to spend a vast majority of their time there. So if we look at these three examples up here, can we estimate the percentage of weekly training that's committed to steady state oxidative conditioning? So just imagine there's 25 hours of training or 20 hours of training in each one of these athletes' weekly training cycles. How much of that time is being spent with an oxidative aerobic training focus? So what are we doing in those situations? We're going on jogs, or we're doing steady state workouts that involve, steady aerobic output, no high intensity interval work, nothing like that. These are guesses on my part, but I kind of put them all here. Even that guy on the far left there, I would put him at 15 to 20% of his weekly training hours probably in an oxidative capacity. It's the person in the middle who probably is upwards of 80 to 90. And that means if he spends 25 hours a week on that bike, probably 21 of them are in an oxidative situation, maybe 22 and a half. Not much time outside of it where he's actually working at a heart rate of 170 beats per minute or something crazy like that. Most of the time, he's going to be in an aerobic situation. Those athletes on the far right, they're probably the least likely to spend time in an oxidative steady state. In fact, most of the time they spend in an oxidative steady state might actually be off season, when they're working with weight management, or if they're just trying to get away from their sport-specific work and have a little bit more of a recovery fitness approach. The divers on the far right probably in a little bit more of an explosive training, working on suppleness, and probably not spending a lot of the time working in like a steady state aerobic output. So quick review, final example that we'll use here, and this is really just an exercise, mind exercise really, let's call it, to make sure we all kind of understand this. You walk out your front door, you burst into a full-blown sprint, and it's a maximal force effort. You're holding on to that effort for as long as possible, but inevitably, after 8-10 seconds maximum, you can feel yourself slowing down. Right? It doesn't take long to feel yourself slowing down from a full-blown sprint, and your sprint turns into a fast run. Eventually, the fast run turns to a slower run. And then it's just a jog, and eventually it's a slow, pathetic jog, or you're so tired and winded, you're actually just walking. What's gone on here? And let's go back to that colored chart there and think about what has happened as we've transitioned through what the primary energy system was at work. All right, so taking a look at this now, can we all understand that this is essentially what happened? We went from that sprint to the hard run to the fast jog to the slow jog, or even that walk at the very end. And we essentially moved right down from that phosphagen primary system to anaerobic glycolysis to aerobic glycolysis to the oxidative system. And that was it. This is kind of the bare bones or the basics. We want to make sure everybody gets this before we move on. And if we do get this, that's the end of part one. That's the end of understanding and recognizing which systems are at work and when. If we've got a pretty good grasp here and we're ready, we're going to move on to part two, which is understanding what's happening at the substrate level. If before we do that, you have any questions, concerns, anything like that, you can email me at the address on the slide, or you can reach out through the site, strongerbcss.ca. Thanks for watching.